Welcome back to the channel, The Real History of Football, Sheffield, home of football. If you haven't seen the first video in this series, then you might find it useful to also watch at some point, as it tries to explain my main motivations for creating these videos, as well as how I want to approach presenting them. In this video, the second in the series, I want to tackle the issue of the first rules and how they influenced and fitted into the early development of the game. Here they are. It's difficult to talk about the rules without mentioning how Sheffield FC was created, so we're also going to do this alongside. I want to show how and why Sheffield can claim to have written the earliest rules of organised association football. I want to go on and show how the individuals who wrote the first rules influenced the rules established by the FA later in 1863, and then influenced the rules beyond that. So, why am I outside the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield? Isn't that the home of snooker, not football? Well, yes, but it's also the site of where the Adelphi Hotel was, and the Adelphi Hotel is the birthplace of Bramall Lane, Yorkshire Cricket Club, Sheffield Wednesday, the Sheffield FA, and it's also where the first Sheffield rules were written down in 1858. Once again, we're going to walk and talk and discuss the history of football while we walk around the area where football first began. In this video, we're going to walk up Bramall Lane to, first of all, an area where Parkfield House sits, which is also near the location of the Sheaf House ground. We're then going to do the walk we did in the first video in reverse and go back from Bramall Lane down Cherry Street, Shoreham Street and Charlotte Road to where Sheffield FC first started, down in that B&Q car park where we started the first video. Let's try and show you all that on the map. We're in Sheffield. This is where we started the video, the site of the Adelphi Hotel, right in the heart of Sheffield city centre, where now the Crucible sits. This is where the Adelphi Hotel was. And now we're walking up the west side of the Bramall Lane Stadium, Bramall Lane itself, and we're here and we're walking up to Parkfield House here and the Sheaf House ground here, then down Cherry Street, Shoreham Street, Charlotte Road, as we did in the first video, but in reverse, back to the B&Q car park site of Sheffield FC's first ground here. Okay, the rules then. Where did they come from? What could have been their inspiration? Who wrote them? How did they fit into this early emerging first culture that was developing in Sheffield from the mid 1850s onwards? In the first video, we ended up at this plaque, which is located outside Bramall Lane on Cherry Street. That was deliberate because it's really where we start our story about the rules in this video. On the 30th of April 1855, Sheffield Cricket Club, soon to become Yorkshire County Cricket Club in 1863, moved to its newly built home at Bramall Lane. Cricket wasn't played during the winter, and some club members were looking for a way of staying active and fit during the close season. To keep fit, these same members started to play organised but unofficial football matches at Bramall Lane. They started doing this the same year they moved into Bramall Lane, so in 1855. This unofficial winter activity became popular among the cricket club members and carried on throughout 1856, and then in 1857 two of these cricket club members decided they wanted to form a separate club that played just football away from Bramall Lane. These two members who led this move were Nathaniel Creswick and William Prest. Creswick and Prest negotiated use of a playing space in a field called Turner's Field, a short walk from Bramall Lane, and on the 24th of October they had established the world's first and oldest association football club. They called it Sheffield Football Club. The ground at Turner's Field became known as the East Bank Football Ground, and if it had survived, today would be the oldest football ground in the world, as it hosted the very first association football matches played by the very first association football club, by the members of Sheffield FC. Of course, we now know this area as the B&Q car park, and that's where we're going to end up at the end of this video. The creation of Sheffield FC by Creswick and Prest is the key moment in the development of football, because before this point, football was not organised, not being managed, not being developed or available to a wide selection of people, at least from a broad set of backgrounds. Before this point, games using a ball were various, fragmented, largely only played in highly inaccessible university college grounds, being highly inaccessible to the general population, and being played by a few elite students behind closed doors. Let me elaborate more about what was happening here. Good inventions usually are built from good creations that have gone before. You can't have a cart without somebody inventing the wheel. You can't invent bread before somebody's invented flour, and so on. I did say in the first video that the idea of football, or the game using a ball, didn't originate in or from one place. There were lots of places where various forms of team football development might have happened. One place cannot claim football. However, the concept of manufacturing, then developing an organised game, was actually created by someone, and it came from various key ingredients, from ideas and what had gone before. That's what happened in Sheffield in October 1857. Using a number of key ingredients, Creswick and Prest created organised football, and from that came many of the other things we associate with the game. Let's look at those ingredients and see what it led onto in terms of an evolving end product. The following presentation is open to debate, of course, but I offer it as a way of explaining just how significant the forming of Sheffield FC was, not just for the development of the rules, but for the game as a whole. The ingredients for organised football were already there in October 1857. The motivation for team fitness, the available space or playing area, the technology to produce a suitable ball, the inspiration from existing ball game rules, etc. Creswick and Prest's leadership took these ingredients and created a new thing, an association football club whose aim was to play organised football. From Sheffield's organised nature, we got the concept of football club members and players, matches, marked out pitches and grounds, club subscriptions, an organised management structure, of course other organised clubs, clubs playing each other for cups in tournaments, people watching as supporters, football associations, and of course agreed rules. This all sprang from this initial idea to form a football club, i.e. Sheffield FC. Creswick and Prest took the flour and baked the loaf. So we've turned off Bramall Lane and we're walking up Alderson Road. And we're walking up to Parkfield House. Parkfield House is where Sheffield FC was inaugurated and created. This is where the early meetings of Sheffield FC took place. The building was used because Nathaniel Creswick lived here until the 1840s. Then later the Chambers family owned the house, and in 1857 it was then home to a young Harry Chambers, who was an early Sheffield FC player. And 6 years later, Harry Chambers was to go on and be Sheffield FC's representative at the meeting to launch the English Football Association in London in 1863. Harry Chambers was the voice of the Sheffield rules at this meeting, and he also had the honour of playing in the very first official show game for the new post-1863 laws of the English FA, played at Battersea Park on the 9th of January 1864. So, to take stock at this point, early ideas of how to play a team game with a ball on a grass pitch would have been experimented with between 1855 and October 1857, largely at Bramall Lane. The process of finding out just how they wanted Sheffield FC to play the game in its early months would no doubt have led Creswick and Press to continue this experimentation at its East Bank ground, playing games and trying rules out to decide which ideas and rules made for a good game to play. It's during this period that I believe there must have been some inspiration from the way ball games were played in universities, and because Sheffield's rules evolved into a game preferring limited ball handling and no hacking, it's likely there was some influence from the Cambridge College rules. But it is important to understand that any influence from places like Cambridge were just part of the ingredients that we've been talking about. Ingredients in the formation of something more significant. An evolving first organised club and a wider footballing evolving culture. Anything like the Cambridge rules were the raw flour in the baking loaf, and the baking loaf being association football. The first 3 years of Sheffield FC history saw the development of the club and, of course, its rules. And as we went into the 1860s, it led to the quick development of other clubs, of church clubs, pub clubs, college clubs, and actual matches between these clubs at different grounds. It also led, of course, to tournaments, so cups, in short, an organically growing football culture that was embraced by an ever-growing number of people, groups of people located around the north and the Midlands of England, far away from Sheffield even. This mass development of the game did not happen before the establishment of Sheffield FC. And the majority of these early clubs preferred, of course, to use the Sheffield rules to structure their matches. The National Football Museum in Manchester and the English FA, to their shame, claim Cambridge AFC is the first football club, with Cambridge University having developed the earliest rules. This is disappointing from such a prestigious body, since there is actually no evidence of this. At best, any evidence that does exist is flaky, and for really good reason, heavily disputed. There are no newspaper cuttings, minutes of meetings, letters home from players. There is nothing that we can actually see to know that this claim is actually true. Furthermore, when Sheffield FC were formed, there were 6 years in between Sheffield FC's birth date and the English FA forming. And we know Sheffield FC was looking to play other teams. Before they played any other club, we know they played matches against the soldiers at Hillsborough Barracks in Sheffield. In 1860, Sheffield FC, of course, famously played the match against the world's second oldest football club, Hallam. And this match is recognised by FIFA as being the first match played between two football clubs in the history of the game. And there were links between Sheffield FC and institutions like Cambridge University. There were people at Sheffield FC who were Cambridge graduates, and people could travel in those days, especially the middle classes. Despite this, there is no evidence of anybody from Sheffield FC playing any other clubs before 1860, And I think the answer to that is quite simply there weren't any. They didn't exist. So this claim made by the National Football Museum and the English FA regarding Cambridge University does need to be properly substantiated to be credible, because at the moment it isn't. As I've said, there's no records of subscriptions at Cambridge, matches, results, anything organised. If anybody knows anything to properly back up Cambridge AFC's and Cambridge University's claims to have had an active organised football club prior to 1857, spawning an active footballing culture into the world, then please put something credible in the comments. The English FA's version of footballing history quite conveniently likes to start the history of organised football in 1863 at the Three Masons Tavern on Great Queen Street in London. This is, of course, when the FA was first set up. This is the National Football Museum's, the FA's and Cambridge University's, basically the establishment's sanitised version of events, and of course suits the narrative that the game just leapt out of Cambridge University as a gift and into the hands of the FA, who then went on to spread the game around the world for the benefit of everybody. The reality was very different. By 1863, football was already becoming widely popular. Early developments in Sheffield were spreading across the north of England and the North Midlands and beyond. Some clubs, especially in the North and Midlands, preferred the very popular Sheffield rules. Some, the Cambridge rules, and others had their own. The inaugural meeting of the FA was to try and create a common set of rules for the game, especially for the newly forming London-based clubs. The meeting drew heavily from both the Cambridge and the Sheffield rules. A representative from Sheffield FC was a key player at this meeting. That's Harry Chambers, of course. The decisions about rules made during this inaugural FA meeting, since they drew from Cambridge and Sheffield's rules, were very heavily biased towards non-handling and no hacking. And because of this, clubs like Blackheath walked out and eventually went on to form the Code of Rugby. It's important that we understand that even after the inaugural FA meeting in 1863, football was widely played according to two sets of popular and established rules, the FA's and Sheffield's. Most of the clubs we now know as the oldest in the professional game, Notts County, Nottingham Forest, Stoke, Wrexham and Sheffield Wednesday, will all have played by the Sheffield rules long before the establishment of the FA. It was 19 years after the Sheffield rules had been developed that both sets of rules were amalgamated. Amalgamated, not absorbed into one common set. Sheffield agreed to drop its kick-in rule and adopt the throw-in, which essentially unified both sets of rules. So the Sheffield rules didn't just disappear in 1863. They were still around and being used and heavily influencing the game, and also heavily influencing and supporting the FA themselves. For example, of the 12 major changes to the rules in the 1860s, 8 of them came from Sheffield. The importance of the Sheffield rules does need to be noted, not just because they were the first, but over time they heavily influenced the game we now know as association football. From the Sheffield rules, we get corners, fouls, free kicks, the indirect free kick, the crossbar, penalties, heading, the forward pass, half-time, assistant referees, the 90-minute game, the golden goal. Oh, and finally, the abolition of actually handling the ball. A fairly significant lot, I guess. Finally, it's worth mentioning that the world's first football tournaments, the Oden Cup in 1867 and the Cromwell Cup in 1868, both were played using the Sheffield rules. So, as we arrive back at where we started the first video, the B&Q car park, location of the East Bank ground, the first home of Sheffield FC, and location of where the first rules of organised football were forged, developed and played. We've seen that these rules were an important byproduct of the incredibly important, significant establishment of the very first organised football club, Sheffield FC, written by the same people who formed that club. The same rules evolved and continued to influence the game's development for many years after their conception. Many modern rules of the game originate from the Sheffield rules. I hope you've enjoyed my second video. For the third, I will be leaving this area and going to the western edge of Sheffield, to Sandygate, the oldest football ground in the world, and home to the second oldest football club, Sheffield FC. If you've enjoyed it, like, subscribe. Until next time.